The arrest that shook Africa. Before we dive in, kindly hit the subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. It was a cool Wednesday morning in Ouagadougou, the sun just beginning to rise and casting a muted light over the city. Yet the stillness was shattered by a wave of news reports that would shake not just Burkina Faso, but the entire continent. Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional president and one of Africa's youngest leaders, had been arrested. The news was so startling that many took a moment to process it. There he was, the man who had stood at the forefront of Burkina Faso's political transformation, now facing criminal charges before the nation's highest court. The allegations were nothing short of devastating: corruption, misuse of national resources, conspiracy, and potentially even high treason. For many, the arrest felt like a betrayal, a sudden reckoning for a leader who had become a symbol of hope and resistance against neo-colonial influence. Those who had once admired him for his bold stances on sovereignty, resource control, and African unity now found themselves questioning everything. How could this have happened? Was the leader many viewed as a champion of a new Africa truly guilty of such crimes? Outside the courthouse, a frenzy of reporters and cameras captured every second as Traoré, his face grim but composed, was escorted into the building by security forces. Some onlookers cheered in support, others jeered, but all were riveted, waiting to see what would unfold next. For those who had followed his rise, from a young captain leading a popular uprising to the leader of a nation yearning for stability, it seemed inconceivable that Traoré could be brought down by scandal. Yet here he stood, no longer the unbreakable figure many believed him to be, now facing the real possibility of imprisonment. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. The judge, a stern and experienced figure, banged the gavel, calling the court to order. It was immediately clear that this would be no ordinary trial. Media presence was overwhelming, cameras stationed at every angle, and journalists scribbling furiously. The prosecution, led by a sharp and no-nonsense attorney, wasted no time in laying out the serious charges against Traoré. The room fell into a hushed silence as the prosecutor delivered a detailed account of Traoré's alleged involvement in a sprawling conspiracy, a web of corruption stretching from Ouagadougou to foreign capitals and back again. The charges, they said, were the result of an extensive investigation into Traoré's actions, both during his military leadership and his tenure as head of the transitional government. He was accused of accepting bribes in exchange for favorable contracts on national resources, leveraging his office to benefit private interests, and mishandling classified national security information, allegedly putting the country's stability at risk. As the prosecutor spoke, the weight of the accusations grew heavier with every word. It was a litany of betrayals and violations of public trust, any one of which would be enough to dismantle the career of an ordinary leader, let alone one of Traoré's stature. Traoré's defense team, however, responded swiftly. His lead attorney, a seasoned strategist known for her sharp intellect and relentless advocacy, rose confidently to her feet. She argued that the charges were purely political, the result of powerful enemies Traoré had made by challenging entrenched interests both within and beyond Burkina Faso. Enemies who had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The accusations, she insisted, were nothing more than a meticulously orchestrated smear campaign designed to tarnish Traoré's legacy and remove him as a rising force in African politics. But as the defense lawyer spoke, it became clear that public opinion was sharply divided. Some believed Traoré had become a victim of political maneuvering, a martyr caught in a relentless battle against entrenched interests and foreign influence. Others, however, saw this moment as long overdue, a reckoning where the truth about his alleged actions would finally be exposed. Yet, even among those who had long criticized Traoré, there lingered a sense of disbelief. Few had expected such a dramatic turn of events, and fewer still could comprehend the speed with which the mighty had fallen. As the prosecution called its first witness, the courtroom settled into a grim and somber routine. There were no cheers, no protests, just the heavy silence of history being written in real time. The nation was watching, Burkina Faso and much of Africa, but no one could predict how the trial would ultimately unfold. Would Traoré clear his name, or would the evidence prove overwhelming? The trial had only just begun, but already it felt monumental. Then, as the day wore on and the gravity of the charges settled like a thick fog over the courtroom, the mood began to shift. Whispers began to circulate among the crowd. An unexpected figure would soon take the stand. Tension grew, each murmur feeding the growing anticipation. Just when it seemed the courtroom could bear no more suspense, the heavy doors swung open. A name whispered in disbelief quickly echoed through the room. Aliko Dangote, the billionaire industrialist and one of Africa's most influential figures, had somehow become entwined in this unfolding drama. His connection to the case was a mystery, but the mere presence of Dangote in the courtroom was enough to shift the narrative entirely. Traoré's arrest had already sent shockwaves through the nation, but now, with Dangote's unexpected arrival, the case was about to take a turn no one could have foreseen. As the judge's gavel struck once more, the silence was thick, almost oppressive. The air itself seemed to tremble with the weight of anticipation. Every eye in the room was fixed on the judge, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, in an unusual move, the judge called for an immediate recess. The murmurs that had been building throughout the proceedings swelled into a chorus of speculation. Reporters scrambled to gather details, and the public was left reeling, desperate to understand what had just occurred. Moments later, as the room was still buzzing with confusion, the doors opened again, and a figure strode confidently inside. The murmurs turned into gasps as the unmistakable silhouette of Aliko Dangote appeared. The man who had transformed Africa's industrial landscape now stood at the threshold of a courtroom, a place far removed from the boardrooms and summits he usually commanded. Dressed impeccably, yet with a composed calmness, Dangote seemed unaffected by the stares and the chaos his presence had provoked. His reputation as a visionary and a shrewd strategist preceded him, but this was different. For a moment, an eerie hush fell over the courtroom, as if everyone present was collectively struggling to grasp the surreal nature of the moment. Why was Dangote, of all people, here to testify in a trial involving one of the most controversial political figures in recent African history? There was no immediate answer. The judge, momentarily thrown off balance by the surprised witness, struggled to regain composure before addressing the court. "Mr. Dangote," the judge said, his voice firm yet tinged with curiosity, "what brings you here today?" The judge asked, his voice laced with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Dangote looked up, his expression unreadable, betraying little emotion as he adjusted his posture, seemingly unfazed by the gravity of the situation. He took a slow, measured breath before speaking, his voice carrying a weight that immediately commanded attention. "I'm here to speak the truth," Dangote replied simply. His words hung in the air, understated but potent. The courtroom, charged with tension, grew even more silent. The judge raised an eyebrow, signaling for him to continue. "I have information that I believe is critical to this case and to Ibrahim Traoré's defense," Dangote added. There was a subtle, deliberate pause as his words sank into the collective consciousness of the room. The mention of Traoré's name in such a context only intensified the intrigue, sending a fresh wave of speculation rippling through the audience. Did Dangote possess inside knowledge? Was there a deeper connection between him and Traoré that no one had previously uncovered? The prosecution immediately objected, arguing that they had not been notified of Dangote's intent to testify. They insisted that his appearance was irregular and should not be permitted, suggesting it was nothing more than a publicity maneuver. The defense, however, was eager, almost desperate, to have Dangote take the stand. They countered that his testimony could be pivotal and that if anyone could illuminate the hidden layers of the case, it was him. Frustrated by the back and forth, the judge called for order and, after a brief deliberation, allowed Dangote to proceed. As the room once again fell into silence, the billionaire spoke, calm but with a conviction that seemed to fill every corner of the chamber. "I've known Ibrahim Traoré for many years," Dangote began, his eyes sweeping across the courtroom, but never settling on anyone's face. "Though our relationship has never been of personal friendship, we have engaged in many professional discussions about Africa's development, resource sovereignty, and the future of the continent." His tone was matter-of-fact, as though he were recounting publicly known facts. But what he said next sent shockwaves through the room. "What many of you fail to realize is that Ibrahim Traoré has been under tremendous pressure, not merely from internal political factions, but from a much deeper, hidden force. Global powers that have been quietly influencing African politics for decades." His words landed like a bombshell. The already tense room seemed to collectively exhale in shock. Dangote paused, watching the ripples of his statement spread through the crowd. It was a provocative claim, even for someone known for his candor. The defense team immediately perked up, sensing a potential shift in the tide. Traoré's lead attorney, a sharp and widely respected legal mind, quickly rose to her feet. "Mr. Dangote," she said firmly, "are you suggesting that the charges against my client are part of a larger conspiracy? And if so, who exactly are these global forces you're referring to?" Her voice was calm but demanded clarity. Dangote met her gaze for a moment, his eyes momentarily softening. "What I am saying," and he replied, "is that Traoré, like many African leaders who have dared to challenge the status quo, has been ensnared in a game he did not initiate. There are forces behind the scenes, powerful interests, determined to reshape the future of Africa to fit their own designs. Traoré was merely a significant obstacle to their plans. These charges against him are not coincidental. They are part of a broader agenda. He offered no specifics, but the implications were heavy enough. The courtroom erupted into murmurs and whispers, each person struggling to process the enormity of what Dangote had just alleged. Who were these global powers? And just how far did their influence extend? And what exactly did he know? The prosecutor was quick to interrupt, accusing Dangote of making broad, unsubstantiated claims. "Mr. Dangote," he said sharply, "you are making incredibly serious allegations without providing any evidence. Are you suggesting that these global forces have fabricated the charges against Mr. Traoré? If so, can you present anything concrete?" Dangote, however, remained composed under the intense scrutiny. "What I am offering is not conventional proof," he replied calmly, "but rather a context, a truth that has long been ignored. When you start peeling back the layers, you'll realize that this case isn't just about Ibrahim Traoré. It's about unseen forces operating behind the curtain, manipulating events to serve a larger, hidden agenda." The judge, appearing overwhelmed by the sudden escalation, called for a brief recess. But the damage had already been done. Dangote's words had introduced a dangerous new dimension to the trial. The courtroom was no longer focused solely on Traoré's fate. It had become about something far greater, a broader struggle for control and influence. Outside the courthouse, the media erupted into a frenzy. Reports flooded in from across Africa and beyond. Dangote's statements became the center of heated debate on news outlets and social media. Could he, with his immense resources and deep ties to political and economic circles, truly be revealing hidden truths? Or was this simply another calculated move to stir public opinion? Regardless of the answer, one thing was certain. The trial had taken a dramatic and unpredictable turn. The stakes had never been higher. Inside, as the courtroom buzzed with a mixture of confusion and excitement during the recess, journalists scrambled to update their stories, trying to make sense of Dangote's cryptic but explosive testimony. The notion that global powers were manipulating African politics was electrifying, almost too colossal for many to comprehend. Yet it was that very ambiguity, that suggestion of unseen hands guiding the fate of nations, that made his words so powerful. People dissected his statement, but the truth was elusive. No one could quite figure out who exactly Dangote was referring to or how deep this alleged conspiracy went. In the brief, tense silence following the recess, Ibrahim Traoré sat quietly at the defendant's table, his face a mask of stoic determination. He had weathered many storms before, rebellions, international scrutiny, political betrayals, but this was something altogether different. Charges of corruption and treason were grave enough, but to have a figure like Dangote, with his influence and reputation, hint at a larger, more sinister force pulling the strings, changed everything. At a corner table, Traoré's defense team huddled together. Leading them was Marissa Clark, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney known for her meticulous preparation and tactical brilliance. She was a lawyer who rarely lost a case, but even she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. Dangote's testimony had transformed the battle. It was no longer just about defending Ibrahim Traoré from the charges in the indictment. It had become about unmasking the shadowy forces Dangote had alluded to. "I've dealt with political games before," Traoré murmured, his voice low but edged with frustration as he leaned toward Marissa. "But this is different. Who is Dangote talking about?" Marissa glanced around the room, her mind racing. "Ibrahim, we need to focus on what's tangible," she said firmly. "We have to bring this back to the charges. This isn't about shadowy figures right now. It's about proving your innocence." But even as she spoke, she couldn't ignore the gravity of what Dangote had suggested. Whoever these global powers were, they were likely far beyond anything she had encountered in her legal career. The stakes had just escalated, dramatically. As the recess drew to a close, the courtroom slowly filled up once more, the buzz of hushed conversations growing louder. The prosecution had remained largely silent during the break, but they were ready to respond. In their view, Dangote's appearance was a distraction, a calculated attempt to divert attention from the mountain of evidence they were preparing to present. Yet even they knew that ignoring Dangote's bombshell was not an option. The prosecutor, a man named Peter Suleiman, rose to his feet, his face grim and composed. He knew that the media had already seized upon the emerging narrative. The trial was no longer just Traoré against the state. It had become Traoré versus the hidden powers that Dangote had hinted at. But Suleiman was determined not to let that story hijack the proceedings. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady and deliberate, "you've just heard an extraordinary claim from a billionaire industrialist known for making provocative statements. However, let's be very clear. This case is not about Aliko Dangote. It is not about conspiracy theories or invisible global forces. This trial is about facts, hard facts. And the facts, ladies and gentlemen, are clear. Ibrahim Traoré has engaged in actions that have endangered the stability and security of this nation." The words hung heavily in the air. For a moment, it seemed as if the entire courtroom had taken a collective breath. Suleiman continued methodically, laying out the evidence they had gathered: documents, witness testimonies, financial records, surveillance reports, all painting a picture of Traoré's alleged crimes. He was skilled at constructing his case, his arguments crisp and calculated, his delivery relentless. He knew that if he could keep the jury focused on the tangible evidence and away from the swirling speculation, the case would quickly tip in his favor. But even as he pressed forward, Suleiman understood that Dangote's intervention had already shifted the landscape. The media was ablaze with speculation. Some outlets questioned whether Dangote himself was part of a larger conspiracy. Others wondered if the charges against Traoré were just the tip of an iceberg concealed from public view. Regardless of what happened inside the courtroom, the nation, and much of the continent, was now riveted by the unfolding drama, and the pressure on everyone involved was only growing. Meanwhile, Dangote sat quietly in the gallery, observing the scene with detached calm. His presence was almost surreal. Here was a man accustomed to commanding industries and economies, now simply a spectator, a witness to a much larger game at the play. But his mind wasn't only on the trial. He was thinking about the intricate web he had unraveled over the past days, the connections he had unearthed, the conversations behind closed doors, the forces quietly moving the chess pieces. The deeper he had delved into the matter surrounding Ibrahim Traoré, the more troubling truths he had uncovered. There were whispers of powerful individuals, figures from both the political and corporate spheres, whose interests extended far beyond a single African nation. Dangote had known for a long time that such forces operated in the shadows, shaping policies, controlling narratives, and maneuvering behind the scenes to serve their own agendas. But what he hadn't anticipated was how deeply these forces were embedded, not just in Ouagadougou, but at the very heart of African political structures. They were not distant observers. They were intimately entwined with the very fabric of power. As he sat there lost in thought, his phone buzzed discreetly in his pocket. He glanced down at the screen. An anonymous message: "You're walking a dangerous path. Be careful." Dangote's fingers hovered over the phone for a moment before he calmly typed a response. "I'm already in too deep." This was no longer just about Ibrahim Traoré. The stakes had grown exponentially. Dangote had already made his decision, a decision that would change the course of events irreversibly. He was no longer a mere observer. He had become a player in a far larger and more dangerous game. Back in the courtroom, Traoré's defense team prepared for their turn to speak. They knew that Dangote's testimony could not simply be dismissed. It had shaken the very foundation of the trial. Marissa Clark, in particular, understood the gravity of the moment. The only way forward was to be strategic, to harness Dangote's influence without letting the case spiral out of control. But the more she thought about it, the more one thing became undeniable. Whoever was operating behind the scenes, pulling the strings, was no ordinary opponent. They were a force that could no longer be ignored. The game had changed, and with it, everything about the trial, and Ibrahim Traoré's future that had been thrown into uncertainty. This was no longer about criminal charges. It was about power, control, and the unseen forces shaping the destiny of an entire continent. As the court reconvened, there was a palpable tension in the air. Everyone in the room sensed it. This was no longer just a trial. It was the first move in a far larger, far more dangerous game. The courtroom was a powder keg waiting to explode. The atmosphere had shifted entirely since Dangote's stunning testimony. The legal battle, once strictly about the alleged misconduct of Ibrahim Traoré, had now morphed into something far more complex, far more volatile. Speculation about Dangote's motivations and the identity of the shadowy forces he had hinted at filled the air like thick smoke. Everyone in the room felt the weight of it pressing down. Even the media, which had initially focused on the high-profile nature of Traoré's trial, now found themselves scrambling to cover the deeper, darker implications of Dangote's revelations. This was no longer just a trial about a transitional president facing criminal charges. It was about something far bigger, the future of African sovereignty itself. The defense team had no choice but to recalibrate. Marissa Clark, seasoned and calculating, knew the only way to salvage their position was to seize control of the narrative from the prosecution. As the trial resumed, she stood, her calm and authoritative voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, steady and deliberate, "we are no longer merely addressing allegations against Ibrahim Traoré. We are confronting a far greater reality. This trial," she continued, "has become a stage for unseen forces to orchestrate a spectacle, not just to tarnish my client's reputation, but to distract from the real issues at hand. What we are witnessing is a deliberate and concerted effort to reshape the course of African history, and that effort did not begin with this trial. It has been in motion for a very long time." Her words rang through the courtroom, and for the first time, a visible shift took place. The jurors, many of whom had been skeptical of the defense's strategy, began to lean forward, drawn in by the broader narrative Marissa was constructing. She was reframing the trial, turning it into a high-stakes chess match, with Ibrahim Traoré cast not as the mastermind of wrongdoing, but as a pawn in a far grander, more insidious game. The more Marissa spoke, the clearer it became. She wasn't just defending Traoré, she was launching the first salvo in a larger campaign to expose a sprawling conspiracy that reached far beyond one man. "We've heard from Mr. Dangote," she continued, "a man known for his forthrightness and his unparalleled access to corridors of power most of us can only imagine. His testimony, though provocative, is critical. His statements about the forces manipulating our political landscape are not fantasies. They are warnings we can no longer afford to ignore. This trial, this case, is not merely about Ibrahim Traoré's alleged actions. It is about those who have been pulling the strings behind the scenes, those who have been quietly steering the destiny of not just our nation, but of the entire continent." The defense team's argument was bold, almost revolutionary. It wasn't just a defense of Traoré anymore. It was an indictment of the hidden powers whose influence had brought this case into existence. Marissa's words were carefully chosen, calculated to force the jury to rethink everything they thought they knew about the trial. She wasn't asking them to disregard the charges. She was asking them to widen their gaze, to see the trial not as an end, but as the latest battle in a long, shadowy war for Africa's future. The prosecution, however, wasn't about to let this new narrative take hold without a fight. Peter Suleiman, the lead prosecutor, was quick to respond. He knew that if the defense succeeded in shifting attention from Traoré's actions to these vague, unseen forces, they risked losing control of the jury's perception. He needed to bring the focus back, sharply before him, to the tangible evidence. "I implore the jury," Suleiman began, his voice layered with authority, "not to be swayed by these fanciful allegations. We are here because of concrete evidence, evidence that ties Ibrahim Traoré to multiple acts of corruption and misconduct. To suggest that he is merely a victim of some vast conspiracy, allegedly involving global powers, is not only unproven, it is a distraction. We must not let these diversions cloud our judgment. We must remain focused on the facts." His words were sharp and precise, but in the charged atmosphere of the courtroom, they felt strangely hollow compared to the broader drama now unfolding. Traoré had been accused of illegal deals and manipulation that spanned borders. Yet Dangote's words had introduced an uncontrollable variable, a shadowy undercurrent that now threatened to upend the entire trial. For Suleiman, the challenge had become twofold: maintain focus on the criminal charges and protect the prosecution's credibility against the rising tide of doubt. But as he methodically laid out his case, a new complexity emerged. Whispers circulated through the courtroom, rumors that some individuals connected to the investigation had their own links to Dangote, business dealings, partnerships, alliances that stretched across industries and continents. Could Dangote's involvement be more than just an act of support for Traoré? Could he too be entangled in the very forces he had warned about? As the day wore on, the tension inside the courtroom rose to a fever pitch. Ibrahim Traoré, who had maintained remarkable composure throughout the ordeal, now showed the faintest signs of strain. His face, usually unreadable, betrayed the pressure of being caught in the eye of a storm that was quickly spiraling beyond his control. His mind raced. The accusations were no longer the central threat. It was the unseen battle now raging around him, a battle for the truth, for power, for the very soul of the nation. The questions swirling around Dangote's testimony now seemed to implicate Traoré more directly. What was the real story behind these global powers he spoke of? Had Traoré, throughout his political and military career, unknowingly become a pawn in a much larger game, one far more complex and dangerous than he had ever imagined? Despite these troubling thoughts, Traoré remained composed as Marissa pressed forward with her argument. "You are all aware," Marissa continued, her voice steady and commanding, that Ibrahim Traoré has served this nation during its most challenging times. And you know that he has made decisions that were often difficult, sometimes controversial, but at no point has he acted in a way that endangered Burkina Faso's sovereignty or betrayed its people. Yes, he may have made mistakes, as all leaders do, but these accusations are not about those mistakes. They are part of a larger scheme, a coordinated effort to dismantle a figure seen as a threat to entrenched interests, both local and foreign. The defense's strategy had become clear. They weren't merely defending Traoré, they were positioning him as a symbol, a martyr for a greater cause, a leader targeted not for his misdeeds, but for daring to challenge the invisible hands steering the continent's destiny. But even as she spoke, a new, darker realization surfaced. If Dangote's revelations held any truth, the prosecution was no longer their most dangerous opponent. The real battle was against shadowy forces operating far beyond the courtroom's reach. Outside, the media frenzy grew even more intense. Headlines screamed about Dangote's bombshell testimony. Analysts debated endlessly. Was Dangote exposing the first threads of a massive conspiracy? Or was he merely creating a smokescreen, distracting from Traoré's alleged crimes? Every major news outlet in Africa, and many beyond, now treated the trial as the biggest event of the year. Who were these unseen global forces? Were they truly trying to destroy Traoré? Or was he simply another casualty in a game that few could even comprehend? As the courtroom adjourned for the evening, a heavy cloud of uncertainty hung over everyone. Dangote's testimony had opened a Pandora's box, and the question was no longer whether it could be closed, but whether anyone had the strength to face what might come pouring out. Traoré, his defense team, and the prosecution all knew the coming days would bring more revelations, ones that could dismantle everything they thought they knew about power, politics, and justice. The tension in the air wasn't just about a verdict anymore. It was a warning of far greater battles to come. In the days that followed Dangote's testimony, the chaos only intensified. Inside the courtroom and across the nation, rumors, theories, and wild allegations spread like wildfire. Some now championed Traoré as the victim of a global conspiracy, manipulated by unseen powers that had long exerted control over African politics. Others dismissed Dangote's words as a calculated distraction, a last-ditch effort to shield Traoré from the consequences of his actions. But no one could deny the chaos coursing through the media. The world was watching, waiting for the next revelation to drop. Back in the courtroom, the pressure was suffocating. As Traoré's defense team prepared for their next move, they found themselves entangled in contradictions. Their strategy had been to discredit the charges as politically motivated, but now they realized they might be stepping into something much darker, something far bigger than they had ever anticipated. Marissa, ever the sharp and methodical strategist, grew increasingly uneasy. The deeper she dug into Dangote's claims, the more troubling the picture became. A network of connections leading to individuals with the wealth and power to shape nations from behind closed doors. This wasn't just about Ibrahim Traoré anymore. The trial had become a gateway into a hidden world, a world of secret operatives, multi-million-dollar deals, and power brokers operating far beyond the reach of law and accountability. Marissa knew that if she wasn't careful, the entire defense could collapse. And with it, Traoré's last hope. The stakes had never been higher, not just for their client, but for everyone tangled in this unseen conflict. There was a quiet but growing sense of unease among the defense team, a realization that they too might be nothing more than pawns in a much larger and far more dangerous game. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré sat at the defendant's table, a man who had spent his life navigating the harsh realities of politics and power. Yet this trial was unlike any battle he had ever fought. He had faced crises and betrayals before, but never enemies of such scale. Never forces with this level of reach and ruthlessness. Each day, he felt the pressure mounting. The whispers of conspiracy, though chilling, were oddly reassuring. They shifted the spotlight away from his direct actions and towards something larger, something almost too vast to fully grasp. Still, even as his defense team worked tirelessly to devise their next move, Traoré couldn't shake the gnawing thought that had haunted him since the moment Dangote stepped into the courtroom. Was this all part of a larger plan? One that he had been entangled in without ever knowing? His life, his career, everything he had built now resembled a house of cards, carefully constructed through decades of political alliances, strategic decisions, and calculated risks. But that house now trembled under forces he could no longer control. Yes, he had made enemies, powerful ones, but he had also made alliances he believed unbreakable. Among them was his longtime confidant and mentor, the former President Salif Diallo, a seasoned political operator who had guided Traoré through the storms of governance and revolution. Diallo had kept a low profile in the early days of the trial, but as the second week unfolded, he appeared at Traoré's side, offering the steady counsel only a political veteran could provide. "Ibrahim," Diallo said quietly as they sat together in the defense team's conference room, "I've been around long enough to know when the air stinks of something rotten, and right now it reeks." Traoré turned to him, his face reflecting a mixture of frustration and concern. "You're telling me?" Dangote's testimony, all these claims about hidden forces manipulating the system, it's too big to ignore. But who exactly is he talking about? Who has that kind of power? Diallo leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. That's the million-dollar question. Power doesn't just sit in one place. It's a web. And if you follow the right threads, you start to see the patterns. People with a lot to lose if you succeed. People who have spent decades ensuring nothing ever really changes. We've always known politics isn't just about winning elections. It's about controlling the system. And those who have power, real power, will stop at nothing to keep it. The conversation was unsettling, but it was exactly what Traoré needed to hear. This wasn't just a fight for his freedom. It was a battle to expose a hidden game, a game that had been played in the shadows long before he had risen to prominence. But as the days passed and new revelations surfaced, the danger only grew clearer. While Traoré and Diallo conferred, Marissa Clark was deep in strategy sessions with the rest of the defense team, trying to formulate their next move. The more they discussed, the more they realized how little they truly knew. Dangote had pointed to a conspiracy, but the full scope of it was still shrouded. Still, they had to act quickly. The prosecution was preparing to unleash a new wave of evidence that could be catastrophic for Traoré. The defense needed a bombshell of their own, something powerful enough to turn the tide. "I've been looking into Dangote's background," Marissa said, her eyes scanning the documents spread out before her, "and I found something interesting. There are links, subtle but real, between his companies and figures connected to past controversies involving Traoré. It's not definitive, but it raises serious questions." The room fell silent. The thought that Dangote himself might be entangled with the very forces he had warned about was chilling, but it was a possibility they couldn't ignore. "If we can tie Dangote to these networks," Marissa said cautiously, "if we can show his interests align with theirs, we might be able to flip the narrative completely. But we have to tread carefully. We can't afford to move without solid proof." The defense team worked late into the night, combing through records, tracing connections, trying to unravel the web Dangote had only hinted at. As the hours wore on, they found themselves staring at a growing list of names. Individuals tied both to Traoré's political journey and Dangote's business empire. But what did it all mean? The answer still seemed just out of reach. Outside, the media storm continued to rage. Dangote's influence had grown so immense that he was now seen not just as a witness, but as a central player in the unfolding drama. People were desperate for answers, but no one yet held the full picture. As the trial moved into its next phase, everyone involved sensed that the true nature of the battle was only just beginning to reveal itself. But who the real players were and what they ultimately stood to gain remained the most dangerous mystery of all. The stakes had never been higher. The trial had reached a fever pitch. Each day, new revelations rocked the courtroom, and the public's obsession with the proceedings only intensified. The media, once focused solely on Ibrahim Traoré's alleged crimes, was now consumed by the larger mystery that Aliko Dangote had thrown into the spotlight. The web of influence, the shadowy forces controlling events from behind the scenes. Across Africa and the wider world, people speculated endlessly about the powerful figures Dangote had alluded to. But no one could quite piece together the full puzzle. The defense team knew they had to act fast. They had spent countless hours combing through records, connecting threads, and chasing elusive leads. But as the pieces slowly came together, a chilling realization emerged. The conspiracy Dangote had hinted at was far more intricate and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The closer they got to the truth, the more it felt as though they were digging their own graves, disturbing a past that was intertwined with the precarious present. Marissa Clark, Traoré's lead attorney, felt the crushing weight of the case more acutely than ever. She had always prided herself on staying 3 steps ahead of her opponents. But now, with each passing day, the walls seemed to close in. The stakes had grown beyond merely saving her client. This was no longer about Ibrahim Traoré alone. It had become about exposing the hidden power players orchestrating events from the shadows, individuals whose true identities were far more critical than the charges facing Traoré. Late one evening, as Marissa sat poring over evidence in her office, A phone call interrupted her thoughts. The voice on the other end was one she hadn't heard in years. An old contact from the murky world of politics, a former operative who had worked behind the scenes during turbulent times. Known only as M, he was an enigma, a man who had never sought the spotlight, but who possessed knowledge that could reshape the course of history. "I have something for you," M said, his voice low and urgent. "Something you need to know about Dangote." Marissa's heart skipped a beat. She had long suspected that Dangote's role in the trial was no coincidence. Now she was about to get confirmation. "What is it?" she asked, leaning forward. "You've been digging in the right places," M replied, "but you've been looking at the wrong people. Dangote may be a key player, but he's not the one calling the shots. He's a pawn, just like Traoré. There are others, the real masterminds, who've been orchestrating this entire charade." Marissa's pulse quickened. "Who are they?" "I can't give you names, not yet," M said cryptically. "But look deeper into the financial ties between Dangote's companies and certain global investment firms, the ones with enough money to buy entire governments. Once you do that, you'll start to see the real players." The line went dead. Marissa sat back, trying to process what she had just heard. Her instincts told her this was the breakthrough they had been searching for. If Dangote wasn't the true mastermind, then who was? She knew she had to dig deeper. Without wasting time, she summoned her team of researchers and analysts to begin tracing the financial connections M had pointed toward. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré, fully aware that the trial was spiraling beyond his control, had grown more withdrawn. The courtroom battles, the endless media attention, the brutal public scrutiny, all of it was taking its toll. He had been a pillar of strength in his country's turbulent times. But this was different. This wasn't just a fight for his reputation. It was a fight for his very survival. His thoughts often circled back to the same haunting question: who was really behind all this? Traoré had never been naive about power. He knew how the game was played, how alliances were built, and how enemies were made. But what he hadn't counted on was being ensnared in a web so vast, so complex, that even he couldn't see its edges. There were whispers of global financial interests, secret meetings between power brokers, under-the-table deals spanning continents. He had always believed he had a finger on the pulse of political life, but now he realized he had been blind to forces lurking just beyond his reach. His longtime confidant and mentor, Salif Diallo, had noticed Traoré's growing unease. "I know you're under pressure," Diallo said one evening as they sat in the quiet of Traoré's home, "but you have to stay focused. If we've learned anything from years in politics, it's that real power doesn't come from the spotlight. It comes from knowing who's hiding behind the curtain, who's really pulling the strings." Traoré nodded silently. He had spent his career in the public eye, but now he understood. True power was not about visibility. It was about invisibility, about being untouchable. And the people operating behind the scenes, the ones who had orchestrated this trial, had clearly made him a target. The defense team's investigation into Dangote's financial entanglements was gaining momentum. They had unearthed something chilling. Through a web of shell companies and offshore accounts, they traced significant investments from several powerful global financial giants into Dangote's vast empire. It was enough to raise serious questions. Was Dangote a puppet of these shadowy forces? Or was he complicit in the larger conspiracy? The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. Dangote wasn't acting alone. He was at the center of a shadowy network with roots reaching into the highest levels of global finance and international politics. Marissa knew they were standing on the edge of an explosive discovery. But as they dug deeper, they uncovered an even more disturbing truth. This wasn't just about Ibrahim Traoré. The people behind the scenes were playing a much larger game, one that involved reshaping not just the political future of Burkina Faso, but the future of global power itself. The defense team had no choice but to shift their approach. They could no longer focus solely on the charges. They had to expose the system, the hidden network of influence manipulating events from the shadows. But doing so would be dangerous. If they pushed too far, they might find themselves targeted by the very forces they sought to reveal. As the trial moved into its final phase, it was clear. Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for the truth and for the survival of the fragile political system he had once believed in. And the more he learned about the forces at play, the more he understood. Winning this trial might be the least of his concerns. The real battle, the one for the soul of his nation and perhaps the world, was only just beginning. The courtroom had seen its share of dramatic moments, but the days leading up to the final phase of the trial would be unlike anything anyone had ever witnessed. Were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. As Ibrahim Traoré's defense team prepared for their next move, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The prosecution was relentless, presenting a steady stream of evidence that seemed to corroborate their case against the interim president. But the defense had something up their sleeve, an unexpected twist that could turn the entire trial on its head. Aliko Dangote, who had remained silent since his explosive testimony weeks earlier, had become a shadowy figure in the proceedings. His role in the trial had faded into the background, but rumors swirled that he was far more involved than anyone realized. It was clear the defense had not exhausted their strategic options. And with Dangote's cryptic revelations still fresh in the minds of the public and the jury, there was hope that the case could still swing in their favor. Late one evening, as Marissa Clark, the defense's lead attorney, gathered with her team, she couldn't shake the feeling that the most dangerous part of the battle lay just ahead. The last few weeks had brought them closer to the truth, but each step forward had only led them deeper into the darker corners of a sprawling conspiracy. They were no longer just defending Ibrahim Traoré. They were exposing the very forces that had shaped political reality for years, forces far beyond the understanding of ordinary citizens. "We have to play this carefully," Marissa said, staring at the web of connections pinned across the wall. Names, companies, organizations, all linked through Dangote's ventures and intertwined with global financial giants and elite political leadership. "This isn't just about Traoré anymore. We're up against an entire system, and they will stop at nothing to protect themselves." Her voice was steady, but there was a rare edge of uncertainty. She had always trusted her ability to outmaneuver her opponents. But the deeper they dug, the more powerful the entities behind Dangote seemed. They had the resources to bury anyone who stood in their way, and Ibrahim Traoré was at the center of their crosshairs. On the morning of the next court session, the air inside the courthouse felt electric, as if something momentous was about to unfold. Traoré sat at the defendant's table, outwardly calm, though inside he was a storm of emotions. The accusations against him were severe, but they paled in comparison to the revelations he and his team had uncovered over the past weeks. He understood now. He was not merely defending himself. He was fighting to reveal the hidden network of power that had operated in the shadows for decades. The prosecution presented its latest evidence, painting a damning picture of Traoré's alleged activities. But the defense was ready. As the prosecutor finished, Marissa rose. With a thick folder in hand, in a confident stride, she approached the stand. The room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You have seen the evidence the prosecution has presented, but what they have failed to show you, what they have deliberately hidden, is something far more significant. There are forces at play here," she continued, "forces that have shaped this case from the very beginning, manipulating the truth for their own gain." She paused, letting her words sink in. The jury, the spectators, the press, everyone held their breath. Aliko Dangote, the man who testified about hidden power networks, is not a bystander. He is deeply entangled in this web, just like those behind him. The prosecution would have you believe this case is about Ibrahim Traoré and a few isolated allegations. But this, she gestured toward the folder, this is part of a far larger game, a game that has been played behind closed doors for far too long. She unfolded the documents for all to see. "I have here evidence linking Dangote to several global financial firms. Firms that have long meddled in politics at the highest levels. Firms whose vested interests depend on the outcome of this trial. Ibrahim Traoré is merely a pawn in their game." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge's face tightened in concern, but Marissa wasn't finished. "Let me be clear. This trial, this entire investigation, has been hijacked by those whose interests extend far beyond Burkina Faso. They seek to control the narrative, to eliminate any threats to their power, and that is why they orchestrated this case. This is not just a political trial. It is an attack on the very foundation of democracy itself." The defense's bombshell struck like a tidal wave. For a moment, the courtroom was frozen, stunned into silence. If Marissa's words were true, then this trial was no longer just about Traoré's guilt or innocence. It was about unmasking a conspiracy that it could shake the entire geopolitical order. The prosecution scrambled to respond, but the cracks in their case were already beginning to show. Outside, the media went into a frenzy, dissecting every word of Marissa's statement. Some hailed it as the revelation of the century. Others dismissed it as a desperate attempt to shift focus from Traoré's alleged crimes. But one thing was certain: the tide had turned. As the day wore on, the atmosphere inside the courtroom came charged with anticipation. The defense had made their move, and it was a bold one. For Ibrahim Traoré, the realization was both empowering and terrifying. This was no longer just about clearing his name. He was facing down a system, a machine of power and influence that had shaped his entire political life. And as he sat in the defendant's chair, one thought echoed in his mind: the real battle is just beginning. The coming days would see the courtroom transformed into a battleground, not just for justice, but for the future of the nation itself. And at the heart of it all, Ibrahim Traoré would have to decide: would he continue to play the game, or expose the puppeteers who had pulled the strings for far too long? The final chapter of the trial arrived with a heavy sense of finality. The courtroom was packed: reporters, spectators, officials, all waiting for the verdict that could change the nation's future. Ibrahim Traoré sat at the defendant's table, calm but pale, the weight of the past weeks visible in his eyes. He was no longer just a president on trial. He had become a symbol in a much larger battle for truth and sovereignty. As the jury filed back in, the silence was deafening. The foreman stood. In the case of the people versus Ibrahim Traoré, on the charges brought before this court, we find the defendant not guilty. A collective gasp filled the room. Outside, the news exploded. Some celebrated Traoré's vindication as a victory against the hidden forces exposed during the trial. Others remained skeptical, unwilling to believe the depth of the conspiracy revealed. But one thing was certain: the political landscape would never be the same. Traoré rose, shook hands with his defense team, and turned toward the gallery, his face resolute. The battle in the courtroom was over, but a greater battle for his country's future had just begun. Ibrahim Traoré stood tall, his shoulders squared as he walked out of the courtroom into the blinding afternoon sun. The crowd outside parted, silence falling over them as he passed, not as a man defeated, but as a leader reborn. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Traoré said nothing. He simply raised his head, his expression calm but unyielding, and stepped forward, not just out of the courthouse, but into a new chapter of his fight. The battle for truth was no longer hidden, and Ibrahim Traoré, tempered by trial and betrayal, was ready to face it, for his people, for his country, and for a future no longer controlled by unseen hands.